Thank you for taking time out of this busy schedule to show up here. Not everybody did, obviously. I've got an impossible job. How do you squeeze a 70-minute lecture into 50 minutes? You talk fast, I guess, is the way to do it. I was torn about what the subject should be of tonight's lectures. I have little thumb drives for various programs, and which one should I use? You know, flying saucers and science I picked for tonight, which may offend some people, but that's all right. Enjoy. Let's look at the next slide, and the next one. That's a free promo. Okay. Now, for some people, the words flying saucers and science don't belong in the same sentence because everybody knows it's all a bunch of baloney and there is no science to flying saucers, et cetera, et cetera. I'm here to question that approach. The key thing about science is you base your conclusions on evidence, data, facts. Now, the nasty, noisy negativists and the ancient academics and fossilized physicists who say there's nothing to flying saucers don't know what they're talking about, because they don't look at the evidence. Foremost would be the large scientific studies. There's an article in the current issue of Astronomy magazine, The Science Behind UFOs, which mentions none of the large-scale scientific studies, mentions none of the dozen PhD theses that have been done about UFOs, mentions nothing about the physical trace cases, the radar visual sightings, the abduction cases. This is the science behind UFOs? I think it was an April Fool joke. That's when I first saw it. It was on April 1st, I believe. But anyway, here's the cover of the largest study ever done for the United States Air Force, Project Blue Book Special Report 14. Now, the work was done at the Battelle Memorial Institute in Columbus, Ohio. But the report wasn't distributed. A press release was, and it didn't give the title of the report. It didn't say who did the work, Battelle Memorial Institute in Columbus. No reporter would have known who to go to ask questions. And then the Secretary of the Air Force lied. I'm sure that surprises and disgusts most of you. I mean, Secretaries of the Air Force aren't supposed to lie. But in the press release it says, on the basis of this report, we believe that no objects such as those properly described as flying saucers have overflown the United States. Even the unknown 3% could have been identified as conventional phenomena or illusions if more complete observational data had been available. What else is there to talk about? The subject is over. The only trouble is it wasn't true. And because he didn't give any information in the press release, nobody knew who to call, where to look for the data, facts. The report has over 200 charts, tables, graphs, and maps, chock full of data. It has a breakdown by categorization. And when I first read the press release, I had already read the report and trying to think, how the heck can the Secretary of the Air Force lie to the American public in a press release that was shown all across the country, October 1955. So let's look at the next slide. Here's what he said. There's the study, the quote. Let's look at the next one, please. Here's the categorization. Now, the only cases we're interested in are the unknowns, really. 21 and a half. That doesn't look like 3 to me. It's not even a round off of 3. How could he say that? Also, next note here. If there wasn't enough data available about the sighting, it wasn't listed as an unknown. It was listed, as you'd expect, as insufficient information. Psychological aberration, this was. Crackpot cases, in other words, 1.5%. The American Physical Society, to which I and most physicists belong, says 2% of the papers submitted to it are crackpot papers. That means there are more crackpots associated with physics than with flying saucers. I'm one of the few with a foot in each camp, you understand. Not only did they do a categorization, but they did a quality evaluation. So let's look at the next slide. The better the quality of the sighting, the more likely to be an unknown, and the less likely to be listed as insufficient information. It makes good sense. It's what you'd expect if there was really any difference between, the better cases and the poorer cases. And yet Carl Sagan could say that there are interesting sightings that aren't reliable, there are reliable sightings that aren't interesting, but there are no interesting and reliable sightings. Of course, he gives no reference for that stupid comment. I say stupid because the truth is exactly the opposite. Let's look at the next slide. UFO evidence, data on 1,800 cases, about 18% rather, were unknowns. Now here's one that's perfectly appropriate today. The Symposium on Unidentified Flying Objects, hearings before Congress. On my birthday, July 29th, 1968. That's not why they held it that day. I am not making that claim, but it just so happens. There were 12 scientists. I was the youngest. That's probably why I think I'm the only one that's still alive today from that group. 3 papers by astronomers, and yet in today's issue, this month's issue of Astronomy magazine, of course it isn't mentioned. The article is The Science Behind UFOs, doesn't mention any of the studies I'm going to talk about here, nor the quality evaluations. Don't bother me with the facts, my mind's made up. That's the first rule of UFO debunkers. The best paper here, in my opinion, was one by the late Dr. James E. McDonald, a professor of physics at the University of Arizona. He talked to over 500 witnesses, but in his congressional testimony, he presents data on 41 separate cases. I have some copies outside. It's 71 pages long. Multiple witness radar visual cases, sightings by astronomers, by pilots, by meteorologists, over big cities. All your questions are answered. But of course, nobody knows the report exists, but you can buy it outside. Let's look at the next one. Now, the University of Chicago, I wish, University of Colorado study, it's not scientific either. If you read the press releases at that time, scientific study shows no UFOs. That's not what it showed at all. According to a special UFO subcommittee, the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, AIAA, of which I am a member, but I was not a member of their special UFO subcommittee. They said I was biased. I had already reached a conclusion after 11 years of study. According to that committee, they quietly published 30% of the 117 cases studied in detail could not be identified. And interestingly enough, even though I wrote Condon about it, there's not a word about Blue Book Special Report 14, even though there's a whole section on government involvement in UFO investigations. This is scientific. Covers 20 times as many cases as you cover. You're not going to mention it? Oh, well, that's what you expect. They found a lot of cases they couldn't identify. And I love their explanation. One of the pictures, it's a rare natural event that so rare, probably never been observed before. How do you get that out of looking at a picture that people can't identify? Let's look at the next slide. There's Dr. J. Allen Hynek's book. Now, you'd think any astronomer, this article, Astronomy Magazine, is by an astronomer, would start with Allen's book. After all, not only was he chairman of the department at Northwestern University, but he was the Air Force scientific consultant on UFOs for 20 years. Isn't that sufficient reason to talk about his work? Well, he's not mentioned, of course.